A martial arts black belt breaks a teenager's arm in front of hundreds of witnesses at a community center, then calmly tells the crowd that accidents happen when kids don't listen. The sadistic instructor Marcus Kellerman has just shattered 17-year-old Kenny's bone during what was supposed to be a simple self-defense demonstration. But as the boy screams in agony and his grandmother rushes to help, a quiet voice cuts through the chaos from the back of the crowd. That wasn't no accident. The figure stepping forward isn't just another concerned citizen. This is Mike Tyson himself. The martial arts bully has no idea he just tortured an innocent kid in front of the most feared fighter who ever lived. While Kellerman tries to justify breaking a teenager's arm, the former heavyweight champion approaches with that legendary deadly calm. The crowd recognizes their hero and parts like the Red Sea, knowing justice is about to be delivered with devastating precision. Kellerman's students keep recording, thinking they're capturing their master's dominance, but they're actually filming his final moments of arrogance. What happens when you pick the wrong victim in front of Iron Mike? Will the so-called dragon survive learning why some champions never lose their bite? What happened next would terrorize the bully for the rest of his pathetic existence. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Kenny Morrison adjusted his grip on the wheelchair handles as his grandmother settled into the passenger seat of their aging Honda Civic. The October morning air carried the crisp promise of winter, and Kenny pulled his blue jacket tighter around his thin frame as he folded the wheelchair and loaded it into the trunk. "You sure about this, Grandma?" he asked, sliding behind the wheel. At 17, he'd been driving for barely a year, but necessity had made him competent quickly. Dolores Morrison smoothed her silver hair and gave him that look, the one that brooked no argument. "Kenny Morrison, you've been cooped up in that room with your books all week. A little fresh air and community interaction will do you good." Kenny sighed, knowing better than to argue when she used his full name. The Riverside Community Center's annual Fitness and Wellness Day had been circled on their kitchen calendar for weeks, though he'd hoped she might forget. The last thing he wanted was to spend his Saturday morning surrounded by crowds of people, especially after what had happened at school with Jason Brewster and his crew earlier in the week. Their duplex sat on Maple Street, a modest neighborhood, where the houses were small but the yards were well kept. Kenny had grown up here after the accident, after his parents died, and everything changed. That was 3 years ago now, but some mornings he still woke up expecting to hear his dad making coffee in the kitchen. Besides, Dolores continued as they pulled out of the driveway. "I need to get my blood pressure checked, and you know Dr. Martinez said I should be more social. We're killing 2 birds with 1 stone." Kenny nodded, though his stomach tightened at the thought of being around so many people. At school, he'd learned to navigate the hallways like a ghost, avoiding Jason's group and staying invisible. But community events were different. Nowhere to hide, nowhere to blend into the background. "You've been worrying about something," Dolores said softly. It wasn't a question. After raising him for 3 years, she could read his moods like a favorite book. "Just school stuff," Kenny replied, keeping his eyes on the road. He couldn't tell her about the locker room incident, about Jason shoving him into the wall and calling him a freak, about the other kids laughing. She had enough to worry about with her arthritis and the bills that seemed to multiply like weeds. They drove through downtown Riverside, past the library where Dolores worked part-time and the grocery store where Kenny bagged groceries after school. It was a good town, the kind of place where neighbors still waved and shopkeepers knew your name. But even good towns had their shadows, and Kenny had learned to stay out of them. The community center parking lot was already crowded when they arrived at 9:15. Kenny found a spot near the entrance and helped his grandmother into her wheelchair, noting how she winced when she moved. She never complained, but he saw the pain in the careful way she positioned herself. "Look at all these people," Dolores said with genuine enthusiasm as they approached the building. A banner stretched across the entrance, "Riverside Fitness and Wellness Day, building stronger communities." Kenny pushed the wheelchair through the automatic doors, and immediately the sounds and smells of the crowded gymnasium hit him. Dozens of booths lined the walls, volunteers calling out information about health screenings and fitness programs. In the center of the space, blue mats had been arranged in a large square, and Kenny's stomach dropped as he read the sign. "Martial Arts Demonstration, Kellerman's Combat Academy." He was about to suggest they start with the health screenings when a voice boomed across the gymnasium, commanding and confident. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, we'll be beginning our self-defense demonstration in just a few minutes." Marcus Kellerman stood at the center of the blue mats like a king surveying his domain. At 35, he cut an impressive figure, 6 feet 1 inch of lean muscle, wrapped in a pristine white martial arts uniform. His dark hair was slicked back with military precision, and his gray eyes swept the growing crowd with calculating interest. "Derek, make sure those boards are positioned correctly," he called to one of his assistants, a young man in his early 20s who jumped to comply. Derek Santos moved with the nervous energy of someone eager to please, adjusting the wooden boards on their stands with careful precision. Kenny watched from beside his grandmother's wheelchair as more people gathered around the demonstration area. Families with children, elderly couples, teenagers with their phones already recording. The atmosphere was festive, expectant. "This is exciting," Dolores whispered, positioning her wheelchair for a better view. "I haven't seen a martial arts demonstration since your grandfather took me to one back in 1972. Kellerman's other assistants, Brian Cole and Tina Walsh, flanked him like loyal disciples. Both wore the same pristine uniforms, though neither carried themselves with their master's supreme confidence. They watched him with the kind of reverence that made Kenny slightly uncomfortable, though he couldn't quite say why. "Thank you all for joining us this morning," Kellerman began, his voice carrying easily across the gymnasium without a microphone. "I'm Marcus Kellerman, owner and head instructor at Kellerman's Combat Academy. For the past 8 years, I've been teaching the young people of this community about discipline, respect, and the warrior spirit." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the crowd. When his eyes passed over Kenny, the teenager felt a chill run down his spine. There was something predatory in that glance, something that made him want to shrink back into his jacket. "Today, I'm going to demonstrate the power that comes from proper training and unwavering discipline," Kellerman continued. He moved to the first set of boards, positioning himself with theatrical precision. "These boards represent the obstacles we face in life: fear, weakness, self-doubt." With a sharp ki, he struck. The boards exploded in a shower of splinters, and the crowd gasped appreciatively. Children pointed and whispered, adults nodded with impressed murmurs. Kellerman smiled, feeding off their reaction. He moved to the cement blocks next, stacking them with ceremony. "True strength comes from the mind," he announced. "The body is merely the weapon the mind wields." Another strike, another explosion of debris, another wave of amazed reactions from the audience. Kenny noticed how Kellerman's students hung on his every word, how they positioned themselves to be seen by the crowd while still showing proper deference to their instructor. Derek Santos caught Kenny's eye for a moment, and something flickered. Across the young man's face, was it embarrassment? Regret? The expression was gone too quickly to be sure. "Now," Kellerman said, his voice taking on a different tone as he surveyed the crowd once more. "The real test of martial arts isn't breaking inanimate objects. It's about working with people, teaching proper technique, building confidence in those who need it most." His gaze was moving systematically through the audience now, and Kenny felt his stomach lurch as those gray eyes settled on him again. This time, the look lingered. Kellerman's smile widened slightly, and Kenny realized, with growing horror, that he was being evaluated, measured, selected for something he didn't understand. "The greatest challenge any instructor faces," Kellerman continued, never breaking eye contact with Kenny, "is taking someone who's never been taught proper discipline and showing them what they're truly capable of achieving." Reverend Patricia Wells from the Methodist Church called out encouragement. "That's wonderful work you're doing with our young people, Marcus." Gary Mitchell, who owned the hardware store, nodded his agreement. "These kids need more of this kind of structured activity." Kenny felt the weight of community approval settling around Kellerman like armor, making him seem not just impressive but righteous. The crowd was completely on his side, ready to support whatever came next. In fact, Kellerman said, his smile becoming something that didn't quite reach his eyes, "I think it's time for a practical demonstration. You there, young man in the blue jacket." The words cut through the gymnasium like a blade, and Kenny felt every eye in the crowd turn toward him. His mouth went dry, and his hands instinctively gripped the handles of his grandmother's wheelchair tighter. "Yes, you." Kellerman said, pointing directly at him now. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Don't be shy, son. This is exactly what young men like you need, confidence. Kenny shook his head slightly, trying to make himself smaller, but the crowd was already responding to Kellerman's invitation with well-meaning encouragement. Go on, honey, called out Mrs. Patterson from down the street. It'll be good for you. Nothing to be afraid of, added Mr. Rodriguez, the mailman. Marcus knows what he's doing. Dolores reached up and squeezed Kenny's hand. Her touch was meant to be reassuring, but he could feel the slight tremor in her fingers that meant she was worried too. You don't have to if you don't want to, sweetheart, she whispered. But Kellerman was already approaching, moving through the crowd with the fluid grace of a predator. His assistants fanned out slightly, creating a subtle wall that made retreat seem impossible. What's your name, son? Kellerman asked, his voice carrying just the right note of friendly concern for the crowd's benefit. Kenny, he managed to whisper. Kenny, a strong name. Tell me, Kenny, have you ever had any martial arts training? Kenny shook his head, his throat too tight to speak. Perfect, Kellerman said, and something in his tone made Kenny's skin crawl. Ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly the kind of young man our community needs to reach. Look at him, intelligent, thoughtful, but clearly lacking in physical confidence. The crowd murmured agreement, and Kenny felt heat rise in his cheeks. He wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor, to be anywhere but the center of this unwanted attention. Now, Kenny, Kellerman continued, placing a hand on his shoulder. The grip seemed supportive to observers, but Kenny felt the underlying pressure, the subtle threat. I know this seems intimidating, but I promise you, every great journey begins with a single step. Will you trust me to help you take that step? The pressure on his shoulder increased slightly, and Kenny understood that this wasn't really a request. The crowd was watching expectantly. His grandmother was looking up at him with worried eyes, and Kellerman's smile had taken on an edge that made Kenny's stomach turn. I don't really want to, Kenny said quietly. Nonsense. Kellerman's laugh was hearty and seemingly good-natured, designed for the audience. Fear is just excitement without breath, son. Come on, everyone's rooting for you. And they were. Kenny could see it in their faces, the expectant smiles, the encouraging nods, the complete trust they placed in this man who seemed so confident and capable. They saw a caring instructor trying to help a shy teenager overcome his fears. They had no idea they were watching a cat play with a mouse. Derek Santos moved closer, ostensibly to help guide Kenny toward the mats, but his presence only made escape more impossible. Kenny looked desperately at his grandmother, but she was trapped too, caught between her protective instincts and her reluctance to cause a scene. That's it, Kellerman said as Kenny took a reluctant step forward. The hardest part is always the first step. Everyone, let's give Kenny some encouragement. The crowd burst into applause, and Kenny felt the walls closing in around him. There was no graceful way out now, no escape that wouldn't make him look cowardly in front of all these people who knew him, who knew his grandmother, who would remember this moment. With legs that felt like water, Kenny Morrison stepped onto the blue mats. The crowd's applause continued, but all he could hear was the sound of his own heart pounding in his ears. Kellerman's hand remained on his shoulder, the grip tightening just enough to let Kenny know who was in control. Excellent, Kellerman murmured, too quietly for the crowd to hear. Now we can begin your real education. First lesson, son, proper stance. Feet shoulder-width apart. Kenny tried to position himself as Kellerman instructed, but his legs were shaking so badly he could barely stand upright. The crowd watched with benevolent interest, seeing nothing more than a patient instructor working with a nervous student. Relax, Kenny, Kellerman said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Tension is the enemy of proper technique. But privately, leaning in close enough that only Kenny could hear, he hissed, "Stop acting like a baby. You're embarrassing yourself." Kenny attempted to comply, but anxiety made his movements clumsy and unpredictable. Every correction from Kellerman came with increasing physical force disguised as instruction. A gentle adjustment to his posture involved fingers digging into pressure points. A supportive grip on his arm left marks that would last for days. "You see," Kellerman announced to the crowd, "young Kenny here is demonstrating a very common problem. He's fighting against the instruction instead of accepting it. This is why so many young people struggle with discipline in today's world. Several parents in the crowd nodded knowingly. They saw Kenny's obvious discomfort as typical teenage resistance to authority, not recognizing the genuine fear in his eyes. "I think I should go back now," Kenny whispered, trying to step toward his grandmother. But Kellerman's grip on his shoulder tightened visibly, and his voice carried an edge that even the crowd could detect. "We're not finished yet, son. The real lesson is just beginning." From her wheelchair, Dolores Morrison felt her chest tighten with worry. Something was wrong. She could see it in Kenny's posture, in the way he kept glancing toward her with desperate eyes. But how could she intervene without causing a scene? The entire community was watching, and everyone seemed to think this was normal, healthy even. "Now, Kenny," Kellerman continued, maneuvering him into position for what he announced as a basic defensive stance. "I want you to resist my movements. Show me how you would defend yourself if someone tried to grab you." Kenny's instincts screamed danger, but the crowd's expectant faces surrounded him like a prison. Children sat cross-legged in front, their parents standing behind them, all waiting to see the shy boy transformed by the magic of martial arts instruction. In the back of the crowd, a man in a gray tracksuit and baseball cap watched with growing interest. His weathered face showed no expression, but his dark eyes tracked every movement on the mat with the focus of someone who understood exactly what he was seeing. "That's it," Kellerman said as Kenny half-heartedly tried to pull away from his grip. "But you're not really trying, are you? You're holding back because you're afraid." This is exactly the kind of weakness that gets young men hurt in the real world. The crowd murmured agreement. This was clearly a teaching moment, a life lesson being delivered by an expert. They had no way of knowing that Kenny's reluctance came not from weakness, but from an animal instinct that recognized a predator. "I want to stop now," Kenny said more loudly, his voice cracking with stress. "And that," Kellerman announced triumphantly to the audience, "is exactly the attitude that keeps people victims their entire lives. Sometimes, Kenny, we have to push through our comfort zones to discover what we're really capable of." He positioned Kenny for what he described as a practical application of joint manipulation, a technique that, properly applied, would demonstrate control and restraint. But Kenny could feel the malicious intent in Kellerman's grip, could sense that this was about humiliation rather than education. "Please," Kenny whispered, but Kellerman's smile only widened. "Pain is how we learn, son," he announced to the crowd. "Your generation doesn't understand that discipline sometimes requires discomfort." The pressure on Kenny's arm increased steadily, methodically. In the audience, Detective Frank Kowalski pushed forward, his cop instincts finally overriding social convention. But the crowd was thick, and he couldn't reach the mat in time. The man in the tracksuit had stopped pretending to be a casual observer. His jaw was set, his hands clenched into fists, and his entire body radiated barely contained violence. He took a step forward, then another, his movement cutting through the crowd like a shark through water. Kenny's whimper of genuine pain cut through the gymnasium's buzz of conversation. Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, finally, beginning to sense that something was wrong. But it was too late. The sickening crack of Kenny's radius bone echoed through the suddenly silent space like a gunshot. Kenny's scream of agony followed immediately after, raw and primal, the sound of innocence being shattered along with bone. He collapsed to the mat, cradling his obviously broken arm, tears streaming down his face as the crowd stood frozen in shocked disbelief. Kenny's scream pierced the gymnasium's silence like a siren, raw and desperate. He crumpled to the blue mat, his left arm bent at an unnatural angle, tears streaming down his face as he cradled the obviously broken limb against his chest. For a heartbeat, the entire crowd stood frozen in horrified disbelief. Children started crying. Parents pulled their kids closer. The festive atmosphere evaporated like morning mist. "Oh my God!" Dolores's anguished cry cut through the paralysis as she struggled to get out of her wheelchair, her arthritic hands fumbling with the brake mechanism. "Kenny, my baby." Several people rushed forward to help her, but she was already trying to crawl from her chair toward her grandson, dignity forgotten in the face of his agony. Kellerman stood over Kenny's writhing form, showing no trace of remorse or concern. Instead, He addressed the stunned crowd with cold professionalism, his voice carrying easily across the silent gymnasium. This is what happens when students don't listen to instruction, he announced matter-of-factly. The boy was too tense, fighting against the technique instead of accepting it. When you resist proper form, injuries are inevitable. The crowd stirred uneasily. Some parents covered their children's eyes. Others whispered among themselves, trying to process what they'd witnessed. Was this really an accident? Could they have misunderstood what happened? Derek Santos knelt beside Kenny, genuine concern flickering across his young face, but a sharp look from Kellerman made him step back quickly. The other assistants, Brian and Tina, immediately began supporting their instructor's narrative. It's unfortunate, Brian said loudly, but this is exactly why proper discipline is so important in martial arts training. The technique was perfectly safe, Tina added. The injury occurred because the student panicked and resisted. Detective Frank Kowalski finally broke through the crowd, his face grim as he assessed the scene. He immediately pulled out his phone, calling for paramedics while dropping to one knee beside Kenny. "Easy, son," he said gently, his experienced eyes taking in the obvious fracture. "Help's on the way. Try not to move that arm." Kenny could barely hear him through the waves of pain washing over his consciousness. His grandmother's voice seemed to come from very far away, though she was right beside him now, stroking his hair with shaking fingers. Louise Brennan, the community center director, appeared in a panic, her face pale as she realized the liability. Nightmare unfolding in her facility. Is there anything? Just clear some space, Kowalski ordered, his cop voice cutting through the chaos. And somebody get these people back. But even as the crowd began to shift and murmur, one voice rose above the confusion, deep and unmistakable, carrying an authority that made everyone freeze. That wasn't no accident. Every head turned toward the back of the crowd, where a figure in a gray tracksuit was moving forward with purpose. The man's face was mostly hidden by his baseball cap, but something about his presence commanded attention, made the crowd part instinctively before him. Kenny's broken sobs continued to echo through the gymnasium as this stranger approached, each step deliberate and threatening, his dark eyes locked on Marcus Kellerman with undisguised menace. The crowd held its collective breath as the man in the tracksuit moved through them like Moses parting the Red Sea. There was something about his presence, compact but powerful, quiet but dangerous, that made people step aside without being asked. "Is that?" Someone whispered. "It can't be." Another voice replied, but uncertainty crept in as recognition began to dawn. The man reached the edge of the mats and slowly, deliberately, removed his baseball cap. The face revealed was unmistakable, scarred from countless battles, the nose flattened by years of combat. But the dark eyes still held that legendary intensity that had once terrorized boxing rings worldwide. "Holy shit," someone breathed. "That's Mike Tyson." A ripple of excited whispers spread through the crowd, but Tyson paid them no attention. His entire focus was on the broken boy lying on the mat and the elderly woman trying desperately to comfort him. He moved with surprising gentleness toward Kenny, kneeling beside the injured teenager with the careful movements of someone who understood pain intimately. When he spoke, his distinctive voice was tender, almost fatherly. "Easy, kid. You're gonna be okay. I promise you that." Kenny looked up through his tears, shock temporarily overriding agony. Even through his pain, he recognized the face from countless boxing posters and old fight videos. But this wasn't the fierce warrior from those images. This was a man radiating protective concern. "Ma'am," Tyson said respectfully to Dolores, his voice losing its harder edges. "Your grandson's brave. Real brave. This ain't his fault, you understand? Not one bit of it." Dolores nodded through her own tears, somehow finding comfort in this stranger's unexpected gentleness. Will he be? "He's gonna be fine," Tyson assured her, though his jaw tightened as he examined Kenny's obviously broken arm. "But somebody's gonna answer for this." The crowd's energy had completely shifted. Cell phones appeared everywhere, people recognizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. The legendary Mike Tyson, former undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, was kneeling on the floor of their small-town community center, comforting an injured child. Kellerman, initially shaken by the celebrity's unexpected appearance, quickly began calculating how to regain control of the situation. This was his demonstration, his territory, his narrative to control. "I don't know who you think you are," he began, his voice carrying its usual authority. "But this is a martial arts demonstration, not some, I know exactly who I am." Tyson interrupted, rising slowly to his full height. Though not as tall as Kellerman, his presence seemed to fill the space around him. "The question is, do you know who you just fucked with?" The crowd gasped at the profanity, but no one moved away. The tension was electric, primal, like watching two apex predators circle each other. "This is my dojo, my student, my business," Kellerman pressed, trying to maintain his authority in front of his followers and the community that had supported him for years. Tyson's response was measured but loaded with barely contained violence. "My name is Mike Tyson, and you just broke a kid's arm for sport, you piece of shit." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. In the distance, sirens could be heard approaching. The paramedics Detective Kowalski had called. But everyone in that gymnasium understood that medical attention was only part of what was coming. Kenny's sobs had quieted to whimpers, but his eyes remained fixed on Tyson's face, finding something there that looked like salvation. The sirens grew louder as paramedics approached, but the crowd's attention remained locked on the confrontation developing between the legendary boxer and the martial arts instructor. The gymnasium felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Kellerman straightened his uniform and attempted to reassert his authority, though sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Look, Mr. Tyson, I understand you're upset, but you don't understand the situation here." This boy was resisting instruction, and "I understand perfectly." Tyson cut him off, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper that had preceded violence. "In 100 fights, I understand you get off on hurting kids who can't fight back." The crowd stirred uneasily. Some people began backing away, sensing violence in the air. Others pressed closer, phones recording everything, knowing they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years. Derek Santos watched his instructor with growing unease. He'd seen Kellerman lose his temper before, witnessed the sadistic pleasure the man took in disciplining students, but never in front of such a public audience. And never with someone like Mike Tyson as a witness. "You don't know what you're talking about," Kellerman said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "I've been teaching martial arts in this community for 8 years. These people trust me with their children." "Yeah." Tyson's smile was cold as winter. "And how many other kids you broken? How many other accidents you had in that fancy dojo of yours?" The question hit home. Several parents in the crowd exchanged glances, suddenly remembering injuries their children had sustained during training. Incidents they'd been told were normal parts of learning discipline. Paramedics burst through the gymnasium doors, wheeling a stretcher between them. Detective Kowalski quickly guided them to Kenny, who was still conscious but pale with shock and pain. "Possible radius fracture," Kowalski told them quietly. "Kids. 17, no medical history I'm aware of." As the paramedics began their assessment, Tyson knelt again beside Kenny. "Listen to me, son. These folks are going to take good care of you, get you to the hospital, fix that arm upright. But I want you to remember something. What happened here wasn't your fault. You got nothing to be ashamed of." Kenny nodded weakly, finding strength in Tyson's steady gaze. "Why are you helping me? You don't even know me." Tyson was quiet for a moment, his weathered face thoughtful. "Because somebody helped me once when I was about your age. And because what happened to you was wrong. Real wrong." The paramedics carefully immobilized Kenny's arm and began preparing him for transport. Dolores insisted on riding in the ambulance, and several community members offered to drive her car to the hospital. As the stretcher was wheeled away, Tyson stood and turned back to Kellerman. The martial arts instructor had been whispering urgently with his assistants, clearly strategizing how to minimize the damage to his reputation. "This ain't over," Tyson said quietly, his words carrying clearly in the suddenly hushed gymnasium. Kellerman's response was carefully calculated for the crowd still recording with their phones. "Mr. Tyson, I understand you're upset, but what happened here was an unfortunate accident during legitimate instruction. If you have concerns about my teaching methods, I invite you to visit my dojo and see how we actually train our students." The challenge was subtle but unmistakable. Tyson heard it, understood it, and his famous temper finally began to stir behind his dark eyes. "Your dojo?" he repeated softly. "Tomorrow night," Kellerman said, emboldened by his assistant's support and the crowd's continued presence. 8 o'clock. Then you can see what real martial arts training looks like. Tyson nodded slowly, and everyone present felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. "Tomorrow night," he agreed. "Just you and me." The crowd buzzed with excitement and disbelief as the implications of what they'd just witnessed began to sink in. Mike Tyson, Iron Mike himself, had just accepted a challenge from their local martial arts instructor. Cell phone videos were already being uploaded to social media, and word was spreading through Riverside like wildfire. Kellerman tried to maintain his composure, but his hands shook slightly as he adjusted his uniform. He'd issued the challenge in a moment of wounded pride, but now reality was setting in. He was going to face a man who had once been the most feared fighter on the planet. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the remaining crowd, forcing confidence into his voice. "I apologize that today's demonstration ended on such an unfortunate note. However, tomorrow evening you'll have the opportunity to witness a true test of different fighting philosophies." Some people nodded, caught up in the excitement of the moment. Others looked troubled, finally beginning to question whether Kenny's injury had really been accidental. Detective Kowalski remained on the scene, taking statements and collecting contact information from witnesses. Tyson ignored the circus atmosphere developing around him. His focus was on the drops of Kenny's blood still visible on the blue mats, a stark reminder of why he was here. He'd seen enough bullies in his life to recognize one, and everything about Kellerman's behavior screamed predator. Derek Santos approached hesitantly, his young face troubled. "Mr. Tyson? I just wanted to say that what happened to Kenny, it wasn't. I mean, accidents don't usually. You got something to tell me, son?" Tyson asked quietly. Derek glanced nervously at Kellerman, who was watching their conversation with sharp attention. "Maybe we could talk later? Away from here?" Tyson nodded and handed Derek a business card from his hotel. "You know what's right and what's wrong. Time to decide which side you're on." As the crowd began to disperse, several community members approached Tyson with mixtures of excitement and concern. Some wanted autographs or selfies. Others expressed worry about the coming confrontation. "Mr. Tyson," Reverend Wells said, her voice gentle but firm, "I hope you'll remember that violence isn't always the answer to our problems." "You're right, Reverend," Tyson replied respectfully. "But sometimes it's the only answer bullies understand." Louise Brennan, still pale with worry about the liability issues, tried to convince both men to reconsider. "Perhaps we could arrange a more controlled environment with proper safety measures and, this ain't about sport," Tyson interrupted. "This is about justice." As he prepared to leave, following the ambulance to the hospital, Tyson paused at the edge of the mats where Kenny had fallen. The image of the boy's terrified face, the sound of bone breaking, the casual cruelty in Kellerman's voice, all of it burned in his memory like acid. He'd spent years learning to control his temper, to channel his aggression into productive outlets. But standing in that gymnasium, seeing the aftermath of senseless brutality inflicted on an innocent kid, he felt the old fire beginning to burn again. "Tomorrow night," he said one more time, loud enough for everyone to hear. 8 o'clock. Your place. Kellerman nodded stiffly, trapped now by his own arrogance and the expectations of his students and supporters. "I'll be ready," he replied, trying to sound confident. Tyson's smile was cold and humorless. "No, you won't. Nobody ever is." As he walked toward the exit, the crowd parted before him like he was royalty. But Tyson barely noticed the attention. His mind was already focused on tomorrow night, on justice delayed but not denied, on showing a bully what real strength looked like when it was used to protect instead of harm. Behind him, Kellerman stood alone on his mats, surrounded by his loyal assistants, but suddenly feeling very isolated indeed. He'd built his reputation on intimidating the weak and the young. Tomorrow night, he would face something entirely different. The reign of the dragon was about to meet its end. The community center had transformed into chaos by 11 o'clock. Police barriers held back a growing crowd of onlookers. News vans from 3 counties had arrived, and social media was exploding with videos of the confrontation. Inside the gymnasium, Detective Kowalski worked methodically, taking statements while Kellerman stood defiantly on his bloodstained mats. The injury was clearly accidental. Kellerman insisted to Officer Janet Torres, who was documenting the scene. The boy panicked and resisted the technique. Any martial arts instructor will tell you that's when injuries occur. His assistants nodded in agreement, their stories perfectly coordinated. Derek Santos remained conspicuously silent, his eyes fixed on the drops of Kenny's blood that maintenance hadn't yet cleaned up. Tyson had left to follow the ambulance, but his presence still dominated the space. Whispered conversations rippled through the remaining crowd. Cell phone footage was being shared and reshared, and Kellerman could feel his carefully constructed reputation beginning to crack. "This is exactly what I've been trying to tell people about celebrities," he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "They think their fame gives them the right to interfere in situations they don't understand." Gary Mitchell, the hardware store owner, shifted uncomfortably. "Marcus, that kid was really hurt." "Are you sure?" "I'm absolutely sure." Kellerman cut him off sharply. "I've been teaching martial arts for 15 years, Gary. I know the difference between proper instruction and accidents caused by student error." But doubt was creeping into previously supportive faces. Mrs. Patterson remembered her nephew coming home from Kellerman's dojo with suspicious bruises. Mr. Rodriguez recalled hearing complaints from other parents that had been dismissed as normal training incidents. Kellerman sensed the shift in mood and decided to go on the offensive. "What we witnessed today was a washed-up fighter trying to relive his glory days by intimidating a respected community member. Mike Tyson is 58 years old. His time ended decades ago." His assistants laughed on cue, but the sound was hollow in the tense atmosphere. "You really think you can take him?" Brian Cole asked, though uncertainty crept into his voice. "I've studied every fighter who ever lived," Kellerman replied, his confidence returning as he fed off his students' attention. "Tyson was dangerous in his prime, but that was 30 years ago. He's slow now, predictable. All that prison time and personal drama has broken him down." Derek Santos finally spoke up, his voice quiet but clear. "He didn't look broken to me." Kellerman's eyes flashed dangerously. "What did you say?" "Nothing, Sensei. Just, maybe we should think about this more carefully." "Are you questioning my judgment, Derek?" The young man dropped his gaze immediately. "No, Sensei. Of course not." Detective Kowalski finished his preliminary interviews and approached Kellerman directly. "Mr. Kellerman, I need you to understand that we'll be investigating this incident thoroughly. If we find evidence of negligence or intentional harm—" "You won't," Kellerman interrupted. "Because there is none. This was a tragic accident that occurred during legitimate instruction." Kowalski nodded noncommittally, but his cop instincts were screaming. 20 years on the force had taught him to recognize predators, and everything about Marcus Kellerman set off alarm bells. As the crowd finally began to disperse, Kellerman gathered his assistants around him. Tomorrow night would either cement his reputation as the man who defeated a legend or destroy everything he'd built in Riverside. "We need to prepare," he told them. "Iron Mike wants to play? Then let's show him what a real warrior looks like." Riverside General Hospital's emergency room buzzed with quiet efficiency as Dr. Melissa Chong examined Kenny's x-rays on the light box. The fracture was clean but significant. His radius had snapped completely through, requiring immediate casting and weeks of healing. "You're lucky," she told Kenny as nurses prepared the casting materials. "It's a straight break, no fragments. With proper care, you should regain full use of the arm." Kenny nodded weakly from his bed, his grandmother holding his good hand while Tyson stood quietly near the window. The pain medication was helping, but the psychological trauma was harder to treat. "The man who did this," Kenny said suddenly, his voice still shaky. "He knew it was going to break, didn't he?" Tyson moved closer to the bed, his weathered face thoughtful. "Yeah, kid. He knew. But why? I never did anything to him. I was just trying to get through the demonstration without embarrassing myself." Dolores squeezed his hand tighter, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "Some people are just cruel. Sweetheart, it's not about what you did or didn't do." Tyson pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down heavily. At 58, he carried the accumulated damage of thousands of rounds, but his presence still commanded respect. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Kenny, you mind if I tell you something about bullies?" The teenager nodded, grateful for any explanation that might make sense of what had happened to him. I grew up in Brownsville, Brooklyn. Rough neighborhood, rougher kids. I was small for my age, scared of everything, got picked on constantly. There was this one kid, Jerome Washington, used to beat me up every day after school. Made my life hell for 2 years. Kenny listened intently, finding it hard to imagine this legendary fighter as a frightened child. One day, I asked my neighbor why Jerome did it. You know what he told me? He said bullies pick on people because they can, not because their victims deserve it, not because they're teaching lessons or building character. They do it because it makes them feel powerful, and they know they can get away with it. What happened to Jerome? Kenny asked. Tyson's smile was grim. I got bigger, got stronger, got trained by a man named Cuz D'Amato who taught me that strength ain't about hurting people, it's about protecting them. One day Jerome tried his usual routine, and I put him on his ass. He never bothered me again. Dolores had been listening carefully, and now she spoke with quiet intensity. Mr. Tyson, what you did today, standing up for Kenny. I can't thank you enough. But this man Kellerman, he's not going to just go away. He has a business here. Connections. What if he comes after Kenny again? He won't, Tyson said simply. After tomorrow night, Marcus Kellerman ain't gonna be in any position to hurt anybody. Dr. Chong returned with the casting materials, and the conversation paused while she worked. The bright blue fiberglass hardened quickly around Kenny's broken arm, a visible symbol of his ordeal. 6 to 8 weeks, she explained. No heavy lifting, no sports, but you should be able to write and handle normal daily activities within a few days. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Kenny turned to Tyson one more time. Will you really fight him tomorrow? Yeah, I will. Are you scared? Tyson considered the question seriously. I'm not scared of fighting him, if that's what you mean. But I am worried about something. What? I'm worried that when I get done with him, he still won't understand why what he did was wrong. Some people, you can't teach them. You can only stop them. The three of them walked slowly toward the hospital exit, an unlikely family united by trauma and the promise of justice. Behind them, word was already spreading through Riverside's medical community about what had happened at the community center and what was planned for tomorrow night. Detective Frank Kowalski's office at the Riverside Police Department was cramped and cluttered, but his decades of investigative work had taught him to see patterns others missed. Spread across his desk were incident reports, complaints, and witness statements that painted a disturbing picture of Marcus Kellerman's operation. The phone rang, interrupting his review. Kowalski. Frank, it's Lieutenant Morrison from County. I heard you had some excitement today. You could say that. Mike Tyson broke up a child abuse incident at our community center. Jesus. Fill me in. Kowalski quickly summarized the morning's events, then got to the heart of his concern. Tom, I've been looking into this Kellerman character for months. We've had 17 complaints about his teaching methods in the past 2 years. Parents claiming their kids were injured during training accidents. Why haven't you moved on it? Same reason you'd expect. Good lawyers, respectable front, and families too intimidated to press charges. But what happened today was public, witnessed by hundreds of people. This might be our break. Lieutenant Morrison was quiet for a moment. What do you need? Time. And resources. I think Kellerman's operation goes deeper than just aggressive teaching. There are rumors about underground fights, connections to organized crime. If I'm right, breaking a kid's arm in public might be the least of his crimes. After hanging up, Kowalski continued his research. The pattern was clear to anyone who knew how to look. Kellerman selected vulnerable targets, isolated them from support systems, and used a combination of physical intimidation and psychological manipulation to maintain control. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Derek Santos stood in the hallway, looking nervous but determined. Detective? I think we need to talk. Kowalski gestured him in and closed the door. About what happened today? About what's been happening for years. Derek's voice was barely above a whisper. The thing is, what you saw today wasn't unusual. Kenny got hurt worse than most, but Kellerman, he enjoys it. He picks out kids who remind him of himself when he was weak, and he breaks them down piece by piece. Why haven't you reported this before? Derek's laugh was bitter. Because I was one of those kids once. Came to his dojo when I was 15, scared and angry after my dad left. Kellerman took me in, made me feel special, taught me to fight. but the price was watching him do to other kids what he'd done to me. Kowalski leaned forward, his experienced interrogator's instincts engaged. Tell me about the underground fights. Derek's eyes widened in surprise. You know about those? I know enough to want to know more. For the next hour, Derek Santos dismantled Marcus Kellerman's carefully constructed facade. The basement of the dojo hosted illegal fighting events twice a month, with betting handled by the Torino brothers. Students who showed promise were groomed to become fighters. Those who didn't became victims used to build other students' confidence and aggression. The worst part, Derek said, his voice breaking slightly, is that he makes us watch. Says it's educational, seeing what happens. To weakness. But really, he just gets off on the fear in their eyes. What changed? Why are you coming forward now? Derek was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. Because when I saw Kenny on that mat today, heard that bone break, I realized I'd become everything I used to be afraid of. And because Mike Tyson looked at me like he could see right through me, see what I really was underneath all the bullshit. Kowalski made careful notes, already planning the investigation that would follow. Derek, what you're telling me is going to require corroboration, evidence, other witnesses. Are you prepared for that? I think so. There are others who want out, who are tired of being part of something so ugly. We just needed someone to believe us. And tomorrow night. Derek's expression darkened. Tomorrow night, Kellerman's going to try to prove he's the alpha predator he's always claimed to be. But he has no idea what he's walking into. Mike Tyson isn't some scared kid he can intimidate. He's about to learn the difference between bullying children and facing a real fighter. As Derek left the police station, Kowalski began organizing the case that would ultimately bring down not just Marcus Kellerman, but an entire network of exploitation and abuse that had operated in plain sight for years. The reckoning was coming, and it would be more thorough than anyone imagined. The Morrison duplex on Maple Street felt smaller somehow when Mike Tyson filled the doorway at 3 o'clock, carrying a bag of groceries and a stack of boxing magazines. Dolores had insisted he come for coffee after their hospital visit, and, despite his protests about imposing, something in her grandmother's authority reminded him of the women who had raised him in Brooklyn. Sit down, Mr. Tyson, she commanded, gesturing toward their modest living room. I'll put the kettle on. Kenny was propped up on the couch, his bright blue cast prominent against the faded upholstery. The pain medication made him drowsy, but his eyes remained alert and focused on their unexpected guest. The small room was filled with memories, framed photographs of Kenny's parents on their wedding day, pictures of Dolores and her late husband at various anniversaries, school photos, tracking Kenny's growth from gap-toothed child to the thoughtful teenager he'd become. It was the kind of space that spoke of love persisting through loss, of family bonds that couldn't be broken by tragedy. You didn't have to bring anything, Dolores called from the kitchen, but Tyson could hear the pleasure in her voice. My mother raised me right, he replied, settling carefully into an armchair that creaked under his weight. You don't show up empty-handed when folks invite you into their home. Kenny shifted on the couch, wincing slightly as his broken arm moved. Mr. Tyson, can I ask you something? Shoot, kid. Were you really scared when you were young? I mean, really scared, not just saying it to make me feel better. Tyson was quiet for a moment, his weathered face thoughtful. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute honesty. Terrified. Every damn day. I was small, weak, had this list that made kids laugh at me. My neighborhood was full of predators, and I was perfect prey. Used to have nightmares about walking to school, about what was waiting for me around every corner. What changed? Cuz D'Amato, old Italian trainer who saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. He didn't just teach me to fight, he taught me that strength without purpose is just violence, but strength with purpose can change the world. Dolores returned with coffee and homemade chocolate chip cookies, the kind that filled the house with warmth and the promise of better days. She served Tyson first, then settled into her chair with the natural grace of someone who had spent decades making guests feel welcome. Tell me about Cuz, she said gently. He sounds like he was special. Tyson's expression softened, and for a moment the legendary fighter disappeared, replaced by a man remembering someone who had saved his life. He was everything I needed when I needed it most. Discipline when I was wild, gentleness when I was broken, faith when I had none in myself. He used to say that fear was just excitement without breath, that the only way to conquer it was to walk straight through it. Kenny leaned forward despite his discomfort. Is that what you're doing tomorrow night? Walking through fear? Nah, kid. Tomorrow night ain't about fear. It's about justice. See, Cuz taught me that real champions don't fight for themselves. They fight for people who can't fight for themselves. That's what separates warriors from bullies. The afternoon sun streamed through the lace curtains Dolores had hung decades earlier, casting gentle patterns across the worn furniture. In this quiet space, surrounded by the evidence of lives lived with dignity despite hardship, Tyson felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the peace of being exactly where he belonged. Mr. Tyson, Kenny said suddenly, will you teach me? Teach you what? To fight. To be strong like you. Tyson studied the boy's face, seeing past the medication-dulled eyes to the determination beneath. First things first, son. We gotta make sure nobody else gets hurt like you did today. Then we'll talk about making you strong enough so this never happens again. Promise. I promise. But Kenny, remember this. The strongest thing you can be is kind. The bravest thing you can do is stand up for someone who can't stand up for themselves. That's what real strength looks like. As the afternoon faded into evening, the three of them sat together in comfortable silence, united by trauma but bound by something stronger. The certainty that tomorrow would bring justice, and that some fights were worth having regardless of the cost. At 5 o'clock that evening, Kellerman's Combat Academy buzzed with dark energy as Marcus Kellerman addressed his inner circle in the converted warehouse that housed his operation. The legitimate dojo occupied the main floor, but it was the basement that revealed his true nature, a concrete dungeon where underground fights had been staged for 3 years. Gather around. Kellerman commanded his senior students and associates. Derek Santos stood uncomfortably near the back, his conscience warring with years of conditioned loyalty. The basement walls were lined with championship belts, fight posters, and photographs of Kellerman with various local politicians and business leaders. But the centerpiece was a regulation-sized fighting ring surrounded by bleacher seating that could accommodate 200 spectators. Tomorrow night changes everything, Kellerman announced, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. When I defeat Mike Tyson in front of the entire community, our operation becomes untouchable. Who's going to question the man who beat Iron Mike? Vince Torino, 45 and soft around the middle despite his expensive suit, leaned against the ring, apron with calculated interest. His younger brother Anthony paced nearby, his lean frame coiled with nervous energy. You sure about this, Marcus? Vince asked, his voice carrying the gravelly tone of a lifetime smoker. Tyson's old, but he's still Mike fucking Tyson. One lucky punch and our whole operation gets scrutinized. There won't be any lucky punches, Kellerman replied with absolute confidence. I've studied every fight he ever had. His reflexes are shot, his conditioning is gone, and he's been living soft for years. The man who terrorized boxing in the 80s doesn't exist anymore. Anthony Torino stopped pacing and faced Kellerman directly. And if you're wrong? If he caves your skull in like he did to Trevor Berbick in 86? Then you find another front for your gambling operation, Kellerman snapped. But I'm not wrong. I've been preparing for this moment my entire career. Derek Santos watched the exchange with growing unease. He'd seen Kellerman's underground fights, witnessed the brutal efficiency with which he dismantled untrained opponents who had no business being in the ring. But those victims were desperate men fighting for money they desperately needed, not legendary warriors with nothing left to prove except that justice still mattered. What about the cops? Asked Brian Cole, Kellerman's most loyal assistant. Detective Kowalski was asking a lot of questions today. Kowalski's been sniffing around for months without finding anything actionable, Kellerman replied dismissively. After tomorrow night, he'll back off. Nobody wants to harass the man who exposed Mike Tyson as a washed-up has-been. The group spent the next hour reviewing plans for the following evening. The fight would take place in the main dojo to accommodate media coverage and community interest. Betting odds would be set by the Torinos, with heavy action expected on both sides. Remember, Kellerman concluded, this isn't just about beating one old fighter. This is about establishing absolute dominance in this community. After tomorrow night, parents will be begging to send their children to me. The police will treat us with respect. And anyone who thinks about crossing us will remember what happened to the great Mike Tyson. As the meeting broke up, Derek Santos lingered in the basement, staring at the photographs of Kellerman's victims, young men who had entered that ring with hope and left with broken spirits. Tomorrow night, one of two things would happen. Either Marcus Kellerman would cement his reign of terror, or Mike Tyson would end it forever. Derek knew which outcome he was praying for. Sunday morning arrived gray and cold, with October wind rattling the windows of the riverside inn where Mike Tyson had spent a restless night. At 7 a.m., he laced up his running shoes and stepped into the empty streets for a 5-mile circuit through the quiet residential neighborhoods. His route took him past the Morrison duplex, where he could see lights on in the kitchen, Dolores making breakfast for Kenny, maintaining the rhythms of normal life despite everything that had changed. He continued through downtown Riverside, past the closed shops and the community center where yesterday's violence had shattered innocence. The running felt good, his body responding to familiar demands despite the decades since his championship days. His breathing was steady, his stride strong, but this wasn't about physical preparation. This was about mental clarity, about remembering who he was and why tomorrow night mattered. At Walt's gym on Industrial Avenue, the 78-year-old owner was already unlocking the doors when Tyson arrived. Walt Kowalski, Detective Frank's father, had been expecting him. "Heard you might be needing some ring time," Walt said, his weathered face creasing into a knowing smile. "Facility's yours for as long as you need it." The gym was old-school authentic. Heavy bags hanging from reinforced beams, a regulation ring with canvas worn smooth by decades of training, and the lingering smell of sweat and determination that marked places where real work got done. Tyson wrapped his hands with practiced efficiency, the ritual as familiar as breathing. When he stepped up to the heavy bag, muscle memory took over. His combinations were still devastating. Left hook to the body, right uppercut, left hook to the head, each punch thrown with the precision that had once made him the most feared man on earth. But this wasn't the wild, destructive fury of his youth. This was controlled violence, purposeful aggression channeled toward justice. Each punch represented something. Kenny's broken arm, Dolores's tears, the systematic cruelty he'd witnessed. In Kellerman's eyes, "Still got it," Walt observed, settling onto a folding chair to watch. "Different than it used to be, though? More focused, if that makes sense." Tyson paused between combinations, breathing steadily. "Used to fight because I was angry at the world. Tomorrow night, I'm fighting for something that matters. That boy Kenny, all the boys like Kenny, all the kids who need someone to stand up for them when they can't stand up for themselves." Walt nodded understanding. "My son Frank called this morning. Says there's more to this Kellerman character than meets the eye. Underground fights, connections to organized crime. You're not just facing one bully tomorrow night." "I know." Tyson returned to the bag. His punches harder now, more intense. "That's why it matters. Stop one predator, you might save dozens of victims." For 2 hours, he worked methodically through his training routine. Bag work, pad drills with Walt, holding the mitts despite his age, footwork patterns that had been drilled into him 40 years earlier by Cus D'Amato. His body remembered everything, responded to demands he hadn't made in years. But between exercises, his mind kept returning to Kenny's terrified expression, to the sound of bone breaking, to the casual cruelty in Kellerman's voice. That was what would fuel him tomorrow night. Not personal pride or championship ambitions, but the absolute certainty that some fights had to be fought regardless of the cost. "You worried about anything?" Walt asked as they finished training. Tyson considered the question while unwrapping his hands. "I'm worried that beating him won't be enough. That he'll just find new ways to hurt people, new victims who can't fight back. Maybe. But tomorrow night, you're going to show this whole community what real strength looks like. Sometimes that's all you can do. Light a candle in the darkness and hope others find their way to it." As Tyson prepared to leave, Walt handed him a business card with a phone number written on the back. "That's Derek Santos, Kellerman's assistant. He wants to talk to you. Says he has information you need to hear. Kid's scared, but he's trying to do the right thing." Tyson pocketed the card, understanding that tomorrow night's confrontation was becoming something larger than a simple fight between two men. It was becoming a reckoning that would expose years of hidden cruelty and give voice to victims who had suffered in silence. The preparation was almost complete. Tomorrow night, justice would be served. At 4 o'clock Sunday afternoon, Marcus Kellerman pulled his black BMW into the Morrison driveway with calculated precision. His visit was ostensibly a welfare check on Kenny's recovery, but everyone involved understood its true purpose: psychological warfare designed to rattle Mike Tyson by threatening those he'd chosen to protect. Kenny answered the door with his good arm, his blue cast prominent against his faded t-shirt. Behind him, Dolores appeared in her wheelchair, her green eyes sharp with protective suspicion. "Mr. Kellerman," Kenny said quietly, his voice steady, despite the obvious fear in his eyes. "Kenny, how are you feeling, son?" Kellerman's voice carried perfect notes of concerned authority, but his gray eyes remained cold and calculating. "I brought these for you." He held out a bouquet of flowers, yellow roses that seemed to mock the gravity of Kenny's injuries. Behind him, Derek Santos and Brian Cole flanked the doorway like bodyguards, their presence more threatening than protective. "That's very thoughtful," Dolores said carefully, wheeling her chair closer to her grandson. "But as you can see, Kenny's resting comfortably. The doctor says he'll make a full recovery." "Wonderful news," Kellerman replied, stepping uninvited into their small living room. His eyes cataloged everything: the modest furniture, the family photographs, the evidence of lives lived paycheck to paycheck without shame or apology. "About yesterday's incident," he continued, settling into the armchair where Tyson had sat just hours earlier. "I want you both to understand that I take full responsibility for what happened. Sometimes, in the enthusiasm of teaching, accidents occur that we could never anticipate." Kenny's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Dolores, however, had lived too long and survived too much to be intimidated by smooth-talking predators. "Accident," she repeated, her voice carrying decades of accumulated steel. "You broke my grandson's arm deliberately, Mr. Kellerman. We all saw it happen." Kellerman's smile never wavered, but something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. "Mrs. Morrison, I understand you're upset. Any grandmother would be. But sometimes perspective gets distorted by emotion. What matters now is Kenny's recovery and his continued development as a young man." The implied threat was subtle but unmistakable. Derek Santos shifted uncomfortably near the doorway, his conscience warring with years of conditioned obedience. "I've been thinking," Kellerman continued, his voice taking on the tone of a reasonable man making generous offers, "that once Kenny's arm heals, he might benefit from some private instruction. One-on-one training that could help him overcome the fears that led to yesterday's unfortunate situation." "No," Kenny said suddenly, his voice carrying surprising strength. "I don't want anything to do with your dojo." Kellerman's expression hardened fractionally before the concerned mask returned. "Kenny, fear is natural after an injury. But the best way to overcome trauma is to face it directly, with proper guidance and support." He said no. Dolores interjected firmly. "I think it's time for you to leave." Instead of standing, Kellerman leaned back in the chair, making himself more comfortable. "Mrs. Morrison, I think you're making a mistake. This community respects strong leadership, disciplined instruction. Kenny could benefit greatly from learning proper respect for authority." The words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and threatening. Derek Santos took a step forward, his young face troubled, but Brian Cole's warning glance stopped him. "You know," Kellerman said conversationally, "I've been teaching martial arts in Riverside for 8 years. I've helped dozens of young men overcome their limitations, face their fears, develop real strength. Some lessons are more difficult than others, but they're all necessary for proper character development." Kenny understood the message clearly. Other boys had suffered, would continue to suffer, and resistance only made things worse. But something had changed in him since yesterday, something that Kellerman couldn't see or understand. "Mr. Kellerman," Kenny said quietly, "Mike Tyson told me something yesterday. He said bullies pick on people because they can, not because their victims deserve it. He said they do it because it makes them feel powerful." Kellerman's smile became predatory. "And what else did the great Iron Mike tell you?" "He told me that after tomorrow night, you wouldn't be in any position to hurt anybody ever again." The temperature in the small room seemed to drop several degrees. Kellerman stood slowly, his movements deliberate and threatening, but Dolores Morrison had faced down bigger bullies than him during 7 decades of hard living. "Get out of my house," she said simply. "Now." Kellerman paused at the door, his mask finally slipping completely. You should tell your friend Iron Mike that. Dragons breathe fire, Mrs. Morrison. Old lions just roar. Kenny surprised everyone, including himself, with his response. Tell him Kenny Morrison isn't scared of dragons anymore. The three men left in silence, but the threat lingered in the air like poison gas. As soon as their car disappeared, Dolores reached for the phone to call Detective Kowalski, while Kenny stood at the window watching shadows that seemed darker than they had just minutes before. Tomorrow night couldn't come soon enough. At 6 o'clock Sunday evening, Mike Tyson sat alone in his modest hotel room at the Riverside Inn, surrounded by the ghosts of his former greatness. Spread across the small desk were letters from fans, newspaper clippings from his championship days, and photographs that captured moments when he'd been the most feared man on earth. The room was Spartan: a bed, a chair, a television that remained dark. Tyson had never needed luxury or comfort when preparing for battle. What he needed was silence, focus, and the mental clarity that came from understanding exactly what he was fighting for. His phone rang, interrupting his meditation. The voice on the other end was familiar but unexpected. Dad? It's Milan. His daughter's voice carried across the miles from California, warm with concern and sharp with worry. Word of tomorrow night's confrontation had spread far beyond Riverside's borders, and family members were beginning to call with questions and fears. Baby girl, Tyson said, his voice softening immediately. How you doing? I'm worried about you. I saw the videos online. Read about this fight tomorrow night. Dad, you're 58 years old. Why are you doing this? Tyson was quiet for a moment, searching for words that could explain the fire burning in his chest, the absolute certainty that some battles had to be fought regardless of age or wisdom or the safer path of walking away. You remember when you were little and kids at school used to tease you about having Mike Tyson for a father? Remember how scared you were that I might show up and embarrass you? Dad, that was different. No, baby, it wasn't. See, I spent so many years being the monster, being the guy everyone was afraid of, that I forgot what it felt like to use strength to protect instead of destroy. Yesterday, I watched a grown man break a 17-year-old boy's arm for sport, and I remembered why God gave me these hands in the first place. Milan was quiet, processing the weight in her father's voice, the absolute conviction that brooked no argument. This isn't about proving I can still fight, Tyson continued. It's about proving that strength without purpose is just violence. But strength with purpose can change the world. Cuz taught me that 40 years ago, and I forgot it for a long time. Tomorrow night, I remember. What if you get hurt? What if, then I get hurt fighting for something that matters instead of dying slowly from doing nothing when I should have acted? Milan, there's a boy here who reminds me of myself at that age, scared, alone, being victimized by someone who gets off on causing pain. If I don't stand up for him, who will? After hanging up, Tyson called his longtime trainer, who expressed similar concerns about sanctioned events and insurance liability. Then he called his lawyer, who worried about criminal charges and civil lawsuits. Everyone had excellent reasons why tomorrow night was a terrible idea, but none of them had seen Kenny Morrison's terrified face or heard the sickening crack of bone breaking under deliberate pressure. None of them understood that some fights transcended logic and entered the realm of moral imperative. At 9 o'clock, Detective Kowalski knocked on his door with news that Marcus Kellerman had visited the Morrison home that afternoon, clearly attempting intimidation. He's escalating, Kowalski explained, trying to get inside your head by threatening the people you're protecting. It's textbook predator behavior. He succeeded, Tyson replied grimly, but not the way he wanted to. Now it's personal. As Kowalski left, he paused at the door. Mike, there's something else you should know. We've been investigating Kellerman's operation for months. Tomorrow night isn't just about one bully. You're taking on a network of exploitation that reaches into organized crime. Win or lose, this is going to have consequences that go way beyond a simple fight. Tyson nodded, understanding. Good. Maybe it's time this whole thing came into the light. Alone again, he returned to his meditation, but now his preparation had evolved beyond the physical. Tomorrow night, he would carry the hopes of every victim who had suffered in silence, every child who had been brutalized by someone stronger, every person who had ever needed a champion but found themselves standing alone. The fight was less than 24 hours away, and Mike Tyson was finally ready to remember who he'd always been meant to be. By 7 o'clock Monday evening, Kellerman's Combat Academy had transformed into a gladiatorial arena. The main training floor buzzed with electric anticipation as crowds gathered outside the converted warehouse, held back by police barriers and the promise of witnessing legend face off against local authority. Inside, the mats had been cleared to create a 20-foot fighting circle, surrounded by folding chairs and standing room for nearly 300 spectators. Local news crews positioned cameras while police maintained order, and the air thrummed with the kind of tension that preceded either triumph or tragedy. Kenny Morrison sat in his wheelchair beside his grandmother near the front, his blue cast a stark reminder of why they were all here. Detective Kowalski had positioned himself strategically near the action, his cop instincts on high alert for trouble that seemed inevitable. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus Kellerman announced from the center of the circle, resplendent in his pristine white uniform. "Thank you for joining us for what promises to be an educational evening about the difference between legitimate martial arts and celebrity posturing." His students and supporters cheered, but the sound felt hollow against the underlying tension. Kellerman looked confident, even arrogant, but those who knew him well could see the slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes kept darting toward the entrance. The Torino brothers held court near the back, taking bets and managing money. With practiced efficiency, Vince whispered odds to regular customers while Anthony watched the crowd for potential trouble, his hand never far from the gun concealed under his expensive jacket. "Where is he?" someone called out from the crowd. "Maybe the great Iron Mike decided discretion was the better part of valor," Kellerman replied, his voice carrying clearly across the packed space. It wouldn't be the first time age and wisdom overcame youthful bravado. But his bravado cracked slightly when Derek Santos approached with obvious reluctance. "Sensei, there's something you should know about tonight. About what you're really facing." "What are you talking about?" Derek's voice was barely audible above the crowd noise. "I've been talking to the police. About everything. The underground fights, the way you select victims, what really happens in the basement. After tonight, it's all going to come out." Kellerman's gray eyes went flat and dangerous. "You did what?" "The right thing," Derek said, surprising himself with his steadiness. Finally, before Kellerman could respond, the crowd near the entrance began stirring, voices rising in excitement and recognition. Through the main doors, moving with the same quiet authority he'd shown 2 days earlier, came Mike Tyson. He wore simple black shorts, a white t-shirt, and boxing shoes that had seen better days. No entourage, no fanfare, no theatrical entrance. Just a 58-year-old man who had promised a broken boy that justice would be served, and who intended to keep that promise regardless of the cost. The crowd parted before him like water, recognizing something primal and dangerous in his presence. Cell phones appeared everywhere, recording every step, every breath, every micro-expression that might reveal fear or confidence. Kenny felt tears spring to his eyes as Tyson approached their section. "You came," he whispered. "Told you I would," Tyson replied simply, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Some promises you don't break." Across the circle, Marcus Kellerman stood alone on his mats, suddenly looking smaller despite his height advantage, finally understanding that all his preparation and confidence meant nothing against what was walking toward him. The reckoning had arrived. The atmosphere inside Kellerman's dojo crackled with barely contained violence as the two men faced each other across the cleared circle. Every eye in the packed warehouse was locked on this unlikely confrontation. The legendary heavyweight champion and the sadistic martial arts instructor who had tortured a child in front of hundreds of witnesses. "Gentlemen," Detective Kowalski announced, stepping forward in his official capacity, "I need to establish some ground rules before this proceeds. This is not a sanctioned sporting event. Any excessive violence will result in immediate arrest and prosecution." Kellerman nodded confidently, still believing his superior conditioning and technique would overcome Tyson's faded skills. "Detective, I appreciate your concern, but what we're about to demonstrate is simply the difference between legitimate martial arts training and outdated boxing methods." Tyson said nothing, his dark eyes fixed on Kellerman with the focus of a predator, evaluating prey. He'd removed his shirt, revealing a physique that, while thicker than in his prime, still carried the unmistakable power that had once terrorized the heavyweight division. "This is my dojo," Kellerman continued, addressing both Tyson and the crowd, "and will follow traditional martial arts protocols. No gloves, no protective equipment, and we fight until one man submits or cannot continue." "Fine by me," Tyson replied, his voice carrying that distinctive lisp that had become part of boxing folklore. "But when this is over, you shut this place down forever. No more kids get hurt because of your sick games." "We'll see about that," Kellerman sneered, settling into his fighting stance with theatrical precision. Perhaps it's time the Great Iron Mike learned what real discipline looks like. The crowd pressed closer, forming a human wall around the improvised ring. Kenny gripped his grandmother's hand tightly, his broken arm throbbing with phantom pain as he watched his protector prepare for battle. Both men removed their shoes and stepped onto the mats with bare feet, the traditional gesture somehow made sinister by the violence everyone knew was coming. Kellerman began a series of warm-up movements, high kicks, spinning techniques, and flowing combinations designed to impress the audience and intimidate his opponent. Tyson stood motionless, his hands loose at his sides, watching Kellerman's display with the patience of someone who had faced real killers in professional rings. His stillness was more threatening than any demonstration of technique could have been. "You see," Kellerman announced to the crowd as he continued his warm-up, "martial arts is about discipline, control, and the precise application of technique. Boxing is simply crude violence dressed up as sport." "We gonna talk all night?" Tyson asked quietly. "Or are you gonna show me what you got?" The question cut through Kellerman's confidence like a blade. Despite all his preparation and psychological manipulation, he was suddenly facing the reality of fighting someone who had once been the most dangerous man on the planet. Derek Santos watched from the sidelines, his stomach churning with a mixture of anticipation and dread. He'd seen Kellerman destroy weaker opponents with surgical precision, but he'd also studied enough boxing history to understand what Mike Tyson represented: pure, distilled violence channeled through decades of professional training. "Very well," Kellerman said, his voice carrying forced confidence. "Let's begin your education." He settled into his fighting stance, feet positioned perfectly, hands raised in classic martial arts form, every muscle coiled with practiced tension. Across from him, Tyson simply raised his fists in the peekaboo style that had made him famous, his head moving slightly from side to side in that hypnotic rhythm that had mesmerized opponents for decades. The crowd fell silent, sensing they were about to witness something that would be talked about for generations. In one corner stood the representative of disciplined martial arts tradition. In the other, the embodiment of controlled fury and protective instinct. Detective Kowalski raised his hand, looked at both men to ensure they were ready, then dropped it quickly. "Fight." The first exchange revealed everything about both men's approach to combat. Kellerman opened with a series of lightning-fast kicks and hand strikes, his technique flawless and his timing precise. He landed several shots: a stinging kick to Tyson's thigh, a quick jab to his shoulder, a glancing blow to his ribs. The crowd murmured appreciatively as Kellerman seemed to establish early dominance, his superior reach and speed allowing him to strike while staying out of range of Tyson's shorter arms. For 30 seconds, it looked like the younger man's confidence had been justified, but experienced observers noticed what casual fans missed. Tyson wasn't really trying to counterattack. He was studying, learning, cataloging every movement, and timing each technique with the methodical patience of a master craftsman. "Is that all you got?" Kellerman taunted, landing another kick to Tyson's lead leg. The Great Iron Mike reduced to a human punching bag. Tyson absorbed the punishment without complaint, his head moving in that distinctive bob-and-weave pattern, his dark eyes never leaving Kellerman's face. He was downloading information with every exchange: the martial artist's preferred combinations, his recovery time between techniques, the subtle tells that preceded each attack. Derek Santos watched with growing unease. He'd seen this pattern before in Kellerman's underground fights: early dominance followed by systematic destruction. But something felt different tonight. Tyson's defensive movements were too smooth, too confident, too purposeful for a man being overwhelmed. "Come on, old man." Kellerman pressed his attack, throwing a high kick that Tyson barely avoided. "Fight back." Show these people what a washed-up convict can do. The insult was calculated to trigger Tyson's legendary temper, to make him abandon strategy in favor of wild aggression. But the Mike Tyson of 2024 was not the uncontrolled fury of his troubled 20s. This was a man who had learned discipline through suffering, who understood that true strength came from purpose rather than rage. Instead of exploding with anger, Tyson smiled, cold and predatory, the expression of a hunter who had finally understood his prey's patterns. "My turn," he said quietly. The shift was instantaneous and devastating. Tyson stepped inside Kellerman's next kick and unleashed a left hook to the body that folded the martial artist like a broken umbrella. The sound of the punch, a meaty thud that seemed to echo off the warehouse walls, silenced the crowd completely. Kellerman staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock and pain. In 30 years of martial arts training, he had never been hit with such devastating power. The punch had landed with the force of a sledgehammer, driving the air from his lungs and sending shock waves through his entire nervous system. But Tyson wasn't finished. He followed up with a right uppercut that snapped Kellerman's head back violently, then another left hook that caught him flush on the jaw. Each punch was thrown with surgical precision and overwhelming force, the product of techniques refined through thousands of hours of professional training. The crowd erupted as they witnessed the difference between martial arts technique and pure boxing power. Kellerman's kicks and fancy footwork meant nothing against an opponent who could close distance in the blink of an eye and deliver punishment that transcended anything he'd ever experienced. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered as Kellerman stumbled against the wall, his legs unsteady and his vision blurred. Kenny Morrison watched with fierce satisfaction as his tormentor finally faced someone who could fight back. Each of Tyson's punches seemed to avenge not just his broken arm, but every child who had ever been victimized by someone stronger. "How's it feel?" Tyson asked, advancing slowly as Kellerman tried to regain his composure. "How's it feel to be the one who's scared?" But Kellerman wasn't finished. Desperation and humiliation combined to make him dangerous in ways that simple arrogance never could. His mask of control had been ripped away, revealing the cornered animal beneath. And cornered animals, as Mike Tyson knew better than anyone, were capable of anything. Blood trickled from Kellerman's mouth as he pressed his back against the mirrored wall, his carefully constructed image of invincibility shattered along with his confidence. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the local martial arts celebrity struggled to remain upright after absorbing punishment unlike anything in his previous experience. "This isn't over," he gasped, wiping blood from his split lip. "You got lucky with a few cheap shots, old man." But Tyson's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Cheap shots? Son, I've been holding back. You want to see what real power looks like?" But desperation had stripped away Kellerman's remaining sanity. His eyes darted frantically around the dojo before settling on the display wall where various weapons hung as decorations. With the quick movement of a man who had nothing left to lose, he lunged toward a wooden staff mounted near the mirrors. "I'm not going down to some washed-up convict," he snarled, gripping the 3-foot hardwood weapon with both hands. "You want to play rough? Let's play." The crowd gasped and began backing away as Kellerman brandished the staff like a medieval warrior. Several people screamed. Others pulled out phones to call 911. But Detective Kowalski was already moving forward with his hand on his service weapon. "Drop it, Marcus," he shouted. "Drop the weapon now." But Kellerman was beyond reason, beyond fear of consequences. Years of psychological dominance built on intimidating the weak had crumbled in less than 2 minutes of facing real opposition, and his mind couldn't process the sudden reversal of power. He swung the staff in a vicious arc toward Tyson's head, putting all his remaining strength behind the blow. For a split second, it seemed like the weapon might connect, that desperation and leverage might overcome skill and experience. Instead, Tyson demonstrated why he had once been considered the most dangerous man alive. He stepped inside the staff's arc with lightning speed, caught Kellerman's wrists in an iron grip, and twisted with the controlled violence of a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of destruction. The sound of the staff snapping in half echoed through the warehouse like a gunshot. "That's what you did to that boy's arm," Tyson said, his voice deadly quiet as he held the broken pieces of wood. "How's it feel?" Kellerman stared at the splintered remains of his weapon, his face pale with the realization that he had exhausted every advantage, technique, youth, reach, even weapons, and still faced an opponent who seemed unstoppable. "Please," he whispered, the word torn from his throat by terror he'd never experienced before. I I didn't mean. You didn't mean to break a 17-year-old kid's arm in front of his grandmother?" Tyson's voice rose with genuine fury. "You didn't mean to get off on torturing someone who couldn't fight back?" The questions hung in the air like accusations from every victim Kellerman had ever brutalized. Around the warehouse, his former students watched their supposedly invincible master reduced to a pleading coward, and several began backing toward the exits. Derek Santos felt something break free in his chest, years of suppressed guilt and fear evaporating as he watched the man who had controlled his life through intimidation finally face justice. Kenny Morrison gripped his grandmother's hand tighter, tears streaming down his face as he watched Mike Tyson methodically dismantle the monster who had haunted his nightmares. "This is for Kenny," Tyson said, cocking his right hand for what everyone knew would be the finishing blow. "And for every other kid you ever hurt." The punch, when it came, carried the weight of absolute justice. Not wild revenge, but calculated. Retribution delivered by a man who understood the difference between strength and cruelty, between power and abuse. Kellerman's unconscious body hit the mats with finality. His reign of terror ended not by technique or strategy, but by the simple truth that real strength protects the innocent rather than preying upon them. In the sudden silence that followed, Mike Tyson stood alone in the center of the circle, breathing hard but victorious, surrounded by the wreckage of a corrupt system that had operated in darkness for too long. Justice, at last, had been served. The silence in the warehouse was deafening as Marcus Kellerman's unconscious form lay motionless on the bloodstained mats. Mike Tyson stood over his defeated opponent, his chest heaving from exertion, but his dark eyes calm with the satisfaction of justice finally served. Detective Kowalski was the first to move, rushing forward to check Kellerman's pulse while simultaneously calling for paramedics on his radio. "We need an ambulance at Kellerman's Combat Academy immediately. One unconscious male, possible head trauma." The crowd remained frozen, processing what they had witnessed. Cell phone cameras continued recording, capturing the moment when legend met reality and emerged victorious. Some spectators cheered, others stood in stunned silence, but everyone understood they had witnessed something that would be talked about for generations. "Is he alive?" someone called out from the crowd. "He's breathing," Kowalski confirmed, though Kellerman's face was already swelling from the devastating final combination. "But he's going to need serious medical attention." Tyson knelt beside Kenny Morrison's wheelchair, his weathered face gentle despite the violence he'd just delivered. "It's over, son. Nobody's going to hurt you again. You got my word on that." Kenny nodded through his tears, overwhelmed by emotions he couldn't quite process. Relief, gratitude, and something else, a sense that the world had been set right again. That justice actually existed when good people were willing to fight for it. As paramedics burst through the warehouse doors, Detective Kowalski began coordinating what he knew would be the largest criminal investigation in Riverside's history. Several of Kellerman's former students approached him voluntarily, finally, ready to speak about years of abuse and intimidation now that their tormentor lay broken on the floor. "Detective," Derek Santos said, his voice steady with newfound courage, "there are things you need to see. Records, videos, evidence of everything that's been happening here. It's all in the basement." The Torino brothers had vanished during the fight's final moments, but uniformed officers were already securing the building's exits. Their gambling operation, their network of illegal fights, their whole corrupt enterprise was about to be exposed under the harsh light of official investigation. Vince Torino's abandoned briefcase, set near the betting area, stuffed with cash and betting slips that would provide crucial evidence. Anthony's expensive jacket hung over a chair, his concealed weapon now in police custody along with enough ammunition to suggest he'd been prepared for serious violence. "Mr. Tyson," Officer Janet Torres approached respectfully. "We're going to need a statement about what happened here tonight." "Self-defense," Tyson replied simply. "Man came at me with a weapon after I'd already beaten him fair and square. Everything's on video." "Indeed," Dozens of cell phone recordings would support his account. The footage showed Kellerman escalating to weapons, Tyson defending himself with minimal necessary force, and justice being served to someone who had terrorized children for years. As the ambulance crew loaded Kellerman's unconscious form onto a stretcher, Tyson felt no satisfaction in his enemy's suffering. This hadn't been about revenge or personal glory. It had been about stopping a predator and protecting the innocent. "What happens now?" Kenny asked as they prepared to leave the warehouse. Tyson's answer was simple but profound. "Now you heal, and you get strong, and you help other kids who need somebody to stand up for them." The legend had become a protector once again, and Riverside would never be the same. At 10:30 p.m., as police crime scene technicians processed Kellerman's combat academy and paramedics rushed the unconscious martial arts instructor to Riverside General, Detective Frank Kowalski found himself coordinating the largest criminal investigation in the town's history. The basement Derek Santos had mentioned proved to be a treasure trove of evidence. Illegal gambling records, videos of underground fights, photographs of injured students, and financial documents linking the operation to organized crime networks stretched across 3 counties. What had begun as a simple assault case was rapidly expanding into a federal racketeering investigation. "Jesus Christ," Lieutenant Morrison said, surveying the evidence spread across makeshift tables in the warehouse. "How long has this been going on?" "At least 3 years for the organized gambling," Kowalski replied, holding up a ledger filled with betting records. "But the systematic abuse of students goes back to when Kellerman first opened. We're talking dozens of victims, hundreds of thousands in illegal gambling revenue, and connections to crime families in 3 states." Derek Santos sat in a folding chair nearby, providing a steady stream of information about the operations inner workings. His cooperation had opened floodgates. Other students and former victims were coming forward with stories of intimidation, assault, and psychological manipulation that painted a horrifying picture of systematic predation. "The worst part," Derek explained to investigators, "is that he made us complicit. Anyone who showed promise as a fighter got drawn into the underground events. Anyone who was weak became a victim used to build other students' confidence. It was like a machine designed to create bullies and destroy the vulnerable." Brian Cole and Tina Walsh, Kellerman's other senior assisters, were brought in for questioning and quickly began providing additional evidence in exchange for immunity. The entire network was collapsing as participants rushed to cooperate rather than face federal charges. Meanwhile, at the hospital, doctors worked to stabilize Kellerman's condition. Dr. Melissa Chong, the same physician who had treated Kenny's broken arm, found grim satisfaction in treating the man who had caused so much suffering. Severe concussion, possible skull fracture, and significant facial trauma. She reported to the police officers maintaining security outside his room. "He'll live, but he's going to be in intensive care for several days." The Torino brothers had been apprehended at the county line, their expensive car loaded with evidence of their gambling operations and connections to other criminal enterprises. Vince's briefcase alone contained enough documentation to support dozens of charges, while Anthony's arrest revealed outstanding warrants in 2 other states. Back at the Morrison duplex, Kenny sat at his kitchen table with his grandmother and Mike Tyson, trying to process the evening's events. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind exhaustion and a strange sense of unreality. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up," Kenny said quietly. "Like this is all some crazy dream where Mike Tyson shows up to save me from the school bully." "It's real," Dolores assured him, squeezing his good hand. "And it's over. That man will never hurt another child." Tyson was quieter than usual, the weight of what he'd done settling on his shoulders. At 58, he'd thought his fighting days were behind him, but justice had demanded one more battle, one final demonstration that strength without purpose was meaningless. "Mr. Tyson," Kenny asked suddenly, "what's going to happen to all the other kids who were hurt by him?" "They're going to get help," Tyson replied. "Real help. The kind that builds them up instead of tearing them down. And they're going to know that what happened to them wasn't their fault." Detective Kowalski's preliminary count identified 17 students who had suffered suspicious injuries over the past 2 years, along with dozens more who had been psychologically traumatized by Kellerman's methods. Each would need counseling, support, and time to heal from wounds that went far deeper than broken bones. As the night wore on, Word spread through Riverside and beyond. Social media exploded with footage of the fight. News outlets picked up the story, and boxing fans around. The world celebrated the return of their hero in the most unlikely circumstances. But for Mike Tyson, sitting in a modest kitchen with a broken boy and his fierce grandmother, the real victory wasn't about defeating an opponent. It was about remembering why strength mattered in the first place. 6 weeks after the confrontation, at Kellerman's Combat Academy, Marcus, the Dragon, Kellerman stood before Judge Patricia Hammond in Riverside County Court, his once proud bearing reduced to the shuffle of a broken man. His injuries had healed, the skull fracture mended, the facial swelling gone. But something fundamental had been destroyed that night when he faced real opposition for the first time in his predatory career. "Mr. Kellerman," Judge Hammond said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "In 30 years on this bench, I have rarely seen such a systematic pattern of child abuse disguised as legitimate instruction. The evidence presented by the prosecution paints a picture of calculated cruelty that shocks the conscience." Kenny Morrison sat in the gallery beside his grandmother, his left arm finally free of the blue cast that had symbolized his ordeal. The bone had healed perfectly, Dr. Chong reported, but the psychological healing was ongoing, aided by weekly counseling sessions and a new sense of empowerment that came from watching justice prevail. Detective Kowalski's investigation had uncovered 17 documented cases of suspicious injuries, 43 reports of psychological abuse, and a criminal network that had operated with impunity for years. The Torino brothers were facing federal racketeering charges, while several other associates had accepted plea agreements in exchange for testimony. "The defendant will serve 5 years in state prison," Judge Hammond continued, followed by lifetime prohibition from operating any martial arts school or instructional facility. Additionally, the court orders full restitution to all identified victims and mandatory psychological evaluation. Derek Santos watched from the back of the courtroom, his own legal troubles resolved through his cooperation with authorities. He'd been sentenced to community service and mandatory counseling, but more importantly, he'd found the courage to rebuild his life around helping others rather than enabling predators. The dojo itself had been permanently closed, its equipment donated to legitimate community programs. The building sat empty now, windows boarded up, a monument to how quickly empires built on cruelty could crumble when exposed to light. But the real transformation was happening elsewhere in Riverside. The community center had established a new youth boxing program, funded by an anonymous donation that everyone suspected came from a certain former heavyweight champion. The program emphasized discipline, respect, and using strength to protect rather than dominate. Kenny had been one of the first to enroll, despite his grandmother's initial concerns about him learning to fight. Under the gentle instruction of Coach Maria Vasquez, a former Golden Gloves champion who understood the difference between building character and breaking spirits, he was discovering that true confidence came from within. "How are you feeling about all this?" Dolores asked her grandson as they left the courthouse. "Good," Kenny replied, and meant it. Like the world makes sense again. Mike Tyson had returned to his regular life, but word of his intervention had spread far beyond Riverside's borders. Speaking requests poured in from community groups, schools, and youth organizations. His simple message resonated: real strength protects the innocent, and everyone has a responsibility to stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves. The footage of that night, grainy cell phone videos of a legendary fighter destroying a child abuser, had gone viral worldwide. But for those who were there, who witnessed justice being served with precision and purpose, the images meant something deeper than entertainment. They had seen proof that heroes still existed, that courage could triumph over cruelty, and that sometimes the right person arrived at exactly the right moment to change everything. As they drove home through Riverside's quiet streets, Kenny noticed something he'd never seen before. Other kids walking with their heads up, parents talking openly about protecting their children, and a community that had learned the difference between strength and bullying. One fight had changed everything, not through violence for its own sake, but through the simple demonstration that those who prey on the innocent will eventually face consequences from those strong enough to deliver them. The healing was just beginning, but for the first time in years, Riverside felt safe again. 3 months later, on a crisp December evening, The Riverside Community Center's gymnasium buzzed with excitement as families gathered for the youth boxing program's first amateur tournament. The same space where Kenny Morrison had suffered. His terrifying ordeal had been transformed into something hopeful, a place where young people learned discipline, respect, and the difference between strength and cruelty. Kenny Morrison, now 17 and confident in ways that would have seemed impossible just months earlier, adjusted his gloves as he prepared for his first official bout. His opponent was Jason Brewster, the same boy who had bullied him mercilessly at school, but who had also enrolled in the program after witnessing Kenny's transformation. "You nervous?" Coach Maria Vasquez asked, checking Kenny's hand wraps one final time. "A little," Kenny admitted, "but not the bad kind of nervous. The excited kind." In the front row, Dolores Morrison sat proudly in her wheelchair, wearing a handmade t-shirt that read Kenny's Corner in bright blue letters. Beside her, Detective Frank Kowalski watched with the satisfaction of a man who had seen justice served and communities healed. The tournament had drawn spectators from across the county, but most eyes were focused on the back of the gymnasium, where a familiar figure sat quietly on a folding chair. Mike Tyson wore simple civilian clothes, jeans, a gray sweater, and a baseball cap pulled low, trying to remain inconspicuous while watching the young people he'd helped inspire. "Ladies and gentlemen," the ring announcer called out, "our next bout features two local fighters who represent everything this program stands for." In the red corner, Jason Brewster, age 16, making his amateur debut. In the blue corner, Kenny Morrison, also 16, fighting for the first time since recovering from a serious injury. The crowd applauded respectfully, but those who knew the full story understood they were witnessing something special. Two boys who had been trapped in a cycle of bullying and victimization, now facing each other with mutual respect and proper supervision. The bell rang, and both fighters touched gloves before beginning to box. Kenny's technique was still developing, but his heart was enormous. Jason, despite his previous bullying behavior, showed genuine sportsmanship and technical skill that surprised everyone who remembered him as just another schoolyard thug. For 3 two-minute rounds, they battled with the kind of clean, respectful competition that Coach Vasquez had drilled into all her students. When the final bell rang, both boys embraced at the center of the ring, exhausted but proud of their effort. "Winner by unanimous decision," the announcer called out, "Kenny Morrison." The crowd erupted in cheers, but Kenny's first gesture was to raise Jason's hand alongside his own, acknowledging his opponent's courage and skill. In that moment, everyone present understood that the real victory wasn't about who won or lost. It was about young people learning to channel aggression into positive competition rather than destructive bullying. As the crowd dispersed and families congratulated their young fighters, Mike Tyson rose quietly from his chair and began moving toward the exit. His work here was complete. Kenny had become strong enough to protect himself and others. The community had learned to identify and stop predators, and the cycle of healing could continue without his direct involvement. But Kenny spotted him leaving and called out, "Mr. Tyson, wait." Tyson paused as the teenager jogged over, still wearing his boxing gloves and sweating from his victory. "Thank you," Kenny said simply, "for everything, for showing me what real strength looks like." Tyson smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "You did all the hard work, son. I just reminded you that you had it in you all along. Will I see you again? Maybe, but you don't need me anymore. You got Coach Vasquez, you got your grandmother, and most importantly, you got yourself. That's enough." As Tyson walked into the cold December night, Kenny returned to his family and friends, surrounded by love and support that felt more solid than any victory in any ring. The shy, frightened boy who had been victimized at this same community center was gone forever, replaced by a confident young man who understood that strength came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the courage to protect them. Behind him, Dolores Morrison wiped away proud tears as she watched her grandson celebrate with teammates who had become true friends. The nightmare that had begun with a broken arm had transformed into something beautiful, a community united around the principle that children deserve protection, bullies deserve consequences, and heroes could emerge from the most unlikely places. Some legends never really retire. They just wait for the next person who needs protecting, the next injustice that demands correction, The next moment when ordinary people need someone extraordinary to remind them that courage still exists in the world. And in Riverside, Ohio, on a cold December evening, the legend lived on in the hearts of young people who had learned that real champions don't just win fights, they change lives. If you like the story, please watch another story on our channel and subscribe to the channel.